Okay, well, we're still waiting on one panelist, but I think just in the interest of time, we'll get underway here. So I'll just start off by welcoming everybody to our roundtable on the economics of and regulatory responses to price gouging during the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Max Theiler. I'm a director here at Fideres, and I'll be sort of moderating, master of ceremonies, if you will. We've got a very distinguished panel today. I'll give more thorough introductions when we start off in the presentations, but in short, we've got Dr. Rosa Abrantes-Metz, Managing Director of Global Economics Group and Adjunct Associate Professor of Economics at NYU Stern School of Business. We've got Dr. Frédéric Jenny, Professor of Economics at the SSCC Business School and Chairman of the OECD Competition Committee. We have got Dr. Daniel Gaynor, a Senior Consultant of Competition Practice at the Brattle Group, and Mr. Tembinkosi Bonkalele, Commissioner of the South African Competition Commission. We're still waiting on Dr. Simon Roberts, but hopefully as he dials in, that's the Economics Director at the Competition Markets Authority here in the UK. So thank you all for graciously taking the time to join our, oh, looks like we've got Dr. Roberts. Welcome, Dr. Roberts. We're just getting underway here. I'll mute you for the moment, but you'll be back on in a sec. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all for taking the time, and thank you to our attendees as well for tuning in. Our format today, I think, is going to be a two section for the first phase. I think all of our panelists have prepared sort of a short talk, 5-10 minutes or so. And so we'll go through those initially. And if you have questions, we're going to be using the Q&A section at the bottom. There should be a tab. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Zoom. There's also a hand raising feature, which we're not going to be using. So if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A. And then I can use that at the end to address the panelists. After we finish with the presentations, I'd like to first give everybody on the panel a chance to sort of address any ideas or concerns or questions that they had that were raised by the other presentations. But as we move on from that, we'll open the floor to questions from the attendees. So I guess without any further ado, we'll kick off the first of the presentations. So we're going to start with Dr. Rosa Abrantes-Metz, or Romy as some of us know her. Dr. Rosa Abrantes-Metz is Managing Director in Antitrust, Securities, and Financial Regulation of Global Economics Group and an Adjunct Associate Professor of Economics at the NYU Stern School of Business. She is also a former staff economist at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. A significant part of Dr. Metz's practice focuses on the development of empirical screens to detect market abuse. Among these, she's credited with assisting in flagging the LIBOR manipulation of the financial benchmarks, something you might be familiar with. Dr. Metz has also testified on behalf of the U.S. government, private defendants and plaintiffs on market rigging, and served as consultants on for dozens of competition authorities worldwide, and published extensively on the topics that we're going to be talking about today. She's going to lead us off with a talk on sort of general economic issues involved in the concept of price gouging and the economic arguments in favor of regulatory intervention, and potentially touch on why overregulation may in some cases be doing more harm than good. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Dr. Abrantes-Metz, and take it away. I failed to unmute you. Give me one moment.
Can you hear me?
There we go. You're fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And let me start by thanking Fideres for organizing this very topical webinar. Very interesting discussions we're currently having, obviously because of COVID. And thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be part of this outstanding panel. Since I'm the first, I'm going to pretty much give a general overview of what is price gouging and the economics behind potential intervention in this context. Let me start. So let's define price gouging. So we'll define it as a sharp increase in price for essential items that are due to a shortage. Now, many define gouging as unfair. It is an unfair price increase to some with respect to others. But then this begs the following question. Really, when is a price increase unfair and when is it fair? And whether it is fair or unfair, is it driven by market fundamentals? And if so, which type of market fundamentals? By that I mean true market conditions. Let's define two types of shortages. There's a shortage that is demand-driven. So suddenly the demand for masks increases sharply due to a pandemic. So what happens in this situation? For those of you familiar with demand and supply charts, demand increases. If the supply can't respond immediately in the short run, we see both price increases, and we may see a little bit of quantity increase or not in case supply really can't react, but we mostly see a large price increase. When it is supply driven, there is suddenly, for example, a shortage of gasoline due to some pipeline disruption because of a hurricane. And we see the quantity available is shortened because supply is reduced, and we see price increases. So fundamentally, these are two different situations. And as you might guess, the way I'm going about this is that the treatment for each one of them is not necessarily the same. So let me skip the charts and dig a little bit deeper into these two situations. So both of these are shortages in the sense that the available supply is too low relative to the current demand at the current prices. So they both cause price increases. Now let's think what higher prices do. In general, higher prices may serve two distinct market functions. One is they stimulate additional future supply because there are profits to be made and new entrants will come, or existing firms will expand production, and they allocate resources. Therefore, it is a way of allocating, or essentially, if you extend the meaning of rationing the existing supply across the various consumers. So there's potentially these two functions. When there is a demand shock, a higher price generally serves both of these functions. People suddenly want more masks. They beat up the price for the existing masks. Obviously, the richer can get them and the poorer can't, which is why some intervention sometimes happens. But this market expansion also provides an incentive for mask makers to make more masks. So when that happens, if supply expands, we get prices back down to some level of normality, and we get quantity expanded, and then both rich and poor can buy the masks. So what happens when we prevent the increase in prices? We risk delaying or reducing the desired increase in supply because we cut out the incentive to expand supply, which would have led to lower prices and expanded output. In addition, that encourages hoarding, not just by the consumers themselves for their own consumption, but also to buy and resell at significantly higher prices. Now, when we have a supply shock, things are a little bit different. High prices arguably primarily serve one function. There is a suddenly disruption to the gasoline distribution process, and there's going to be less gas around, and therefore people beat up the price of gas. This is going to allocate the limited supply, but does advantage the richer with respect to poorer to a greater extent. Because if this is a temporary shock, and if we're talking about pipeline disruptions, and if the pipeline can be fixed fairly quickly, then even without any intervention, we may end up getting back to some level of normality where prices and quantity come back to a normal and expected equilibrium. So the question tends to be, do we need to ration current supplies, or do they eventually get rationed anyway? In case of necessities in an emergency or a natural disaster, letting prices adjust and being driven by market conditions delivers an allocation that seems unfair to some people. But if the free, and by that it means if prices are high, the richer can buy them, the poorer can't. But if the free market is not allowed to work to allocate the resources, then some other type of rationing must be adopted. Because the reality is just there aren't enough apples to go around. Whether we let prices vary or whether we do not, there are just too few apples for what it is desired. So in the short run, there is no way around that. So one can do a first come, first served basis. The price of apples isn't allowed to increase, and the first people in the store get some and the last ones get none. Obviously, these advantages early versus late arrival to the store rather than rich versus poor, but it's another type of allocation, of rationing. On top of that, sometimes there are quantity restrictions. The price of apples isn't allowed to increase, and people are only limited to buying one apple each. We all, at least here in New York, saw a good amount of rationing of eggs and meat, toilet paper, and other basic supplies in supermarkets during the peak of the COVID in March and April. But let's now think about a couple of cases and understand and hopefully make clear that understanding the reasons for price increases is critical to understand what should be done, if anything. In case one, an enterprising young man sees a hurricane coming, drives around the affected town, buys up what portable generators exist, and then as a temporary monopolist sells them at very high prices. So the available supply of generators in the town has not changed. He's just going around cornering the market for generators, and then he sells them at very high prices. So arguably, his actions serve no legitimate purpose. He's not increasing quantity, and is just extracting a lot of consumer surplus by charging very high prices. So this is one situation. A different situation is case two. An enterprising young woman, seeing the hurricane coming, brings a truckload of generators in from out of town, 300 miles away, and sells them at high prices at the affected town. So in this case, the supply of generators in the affected town is indeed increased. They're brought from far away. And my question is it unfair that she gets rich by providing a necessary service, increasing the availability of generators to a place that otherwise would have had a larger shortage? Do we really want to discourage this person from increasing the supply of generators? Do we want to discourage others like her? After all, we need more to come into the market in order to solve the shortage problem. Obviously, other questions have to be addressed, such as what's the size of the price increase? So all of these kinds of things need to be thought of when one tries to write up a recipe for how to address these types of conditions. So some price increases are good in the sense that they lead to an increase in supply and help solve the underlying problem of shortage. But what is the size of the price increase? And how much of that is due to true market fundamentals versus pure and complete abuse? It may be difficult to know in real time whether an increase is legitimate or not. Therefore, price gouging policies that blindly apply to all possibilities have a high chance of doing more harm than good. Sometimes it may also be difficult enough to know, even after the fact, whether prices were artificial. And by that I mean prices were higher because there was a shortage, but somebody on top of that really abused their market power and drove prices way too high. Sometimes it may be difficult to determine what part of the price increase is due to that as well. Ex-post economic analysis and investigations are likely required, and the use of empirical screens to monitor price levels and potential market abuse apply directly in this context. Later in this presentation, the example of Katrina and the FTC investigation on Katrina will be discussed. So my question is, should we perhaps just let prices adjust while simultaneously and rigorously investigating whether the observed prices increases are legitimate? or whether they reflect abuses, driving to significant price artificiality. We should work strongly on trying to deter truly abusive price gouging. I am more concerned about intervention that could do more harm than good. If support is to be given to the efficiency versus equity or fairness concerns, then one may, in special conditions, consider temporary subsidies to retailers, for example, while letting actual prices faced by manufacturers adjust freely. That way, manufacturers still face the higher prices. They still have an incentive to increase their supply. Consumers face lower prices. Of course, before supply can adjust, some rationing still needs to happen. But at least when the shock is due to these types of conditions, a demand shock, then we do still preserve the incentive for manufacturers to increase supply, which is at the end of the day what's going to end up solving the shortage problem. And that sums up my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Metz. As I said, if anybody has questions, please go ahead and save them for the end. We have the Q&A panel for this. I'm going to go ahead and mute you now, Dr. Metz, and we'll switch to our next speaker. So next up, we have Professor Frédéric Jenny, who's Professor of Economics at the ESSEC Business School and Chairman of the OECD Competition Committee since 1994. He's been a non-executive director of the Office of Fair Trading since 2000 until 2014. He's also been a judge on the French Supreme Court in the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Chamber, vice chair of the French Competition Authority, and president of the WTO Working Group on Trade and Competition. He's written extensively about trade, competition, and economic development, as and advised many developing countries on competition and trade issues. Professor Jenny will give us an overview of some of the considerations that drove different responses to the issue of price gouging in different countries and jurisdictions during the crisis. Hopefully this can put some of the ideas that Dr. Metz has discussed in kind of more concrete terms, and we can see what sort of in practice was actually done. Sorry, there's a slight delay when I unmute.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I will make a couple of comments on what Rosa said later on, but my talk today is only to look at the responses of competition authorities as they have been during the COVID crisis. And I'll start from the fact that they've had quite different responses when we look at it. And there are a number of determinants of those responses. The first one is whether or not the competition law includes public interest goals. You have to, you are aware of the fact that even within the OECD, most of the competition authorities have public interest goals in their competition law. And if we move out of OECD, and particularly in developing countries, it's extremely frequent that besides promoting consumer surplus, there are many other goals, possibly also fairness, which are written as one of the goals of the law. So that's going to make a difference. The second is whether, I would say from a more theoretical point of view, and we've heard theoretical arguments, there is a strong idea that exploitative abuses should not be pursued, or on the contrary, whether there is more tolerance for going after exploitative abuses. And we have certainly the EU versus the US example. The third one is an institutional difference between competition authorities, whether or not they have multi-functions. And again, that's a model which is quite frequent, where competition authorities may have also some consumer protection. And sometimes the difference between the two functions are not entirely clear, and the ground on which there is intervention is not all that clear. And I'll give you examples from UK and Italy. Next is how the law on exploitation is written. And you do have some countries where those laws can apply to pricing abuses by non-dominant firms. I'll give you the example of Ukraine. So, of course, that makes it easier to intervene. And finally, there's the question of what's the burden of proof for the competition authority. We know that competition law is not particularly, even for countries that have an exploitative abuse provision, is not particularly easy to use. And certainly in Europe, for example, there's a very high burden of proof on what is exactly an abusive price, if you want to use that. We'll see that in some other countries that difficulty was overcome. Okay, let me try to move to the next slide, but yeah. So let's take the first example. I just called price gouging on the FTC site. The answer is your search yielded no result. So that's clear. I mean, no interest on the part of the FTC to talk about price gouging, and I know that we're going to hear why, but in the US there's a very strong feeling, and in fact the head of the FTC in the past has actively tried to discourage states from having price gouging laws. So there's a very strong feeling there that this is not a competition issue, and price gouging should not be an instrument that is facilitated. If we move to the ICN, I mean, the ICN is, of course, a very broad-based organization, and the steering group came up with something which remind me of my time at the WTO. I mean, a diplomatic feat where it's not very clear whether competition law should be used to look at price abuses or price gouging. There's a declaration that price should be at a competitive level, but then after that, there is no particular indication that competition law should be used to try to get there, except for the traditional merger control and practices, control of the general practices. When we moved to the ECN, we moved towards Europe, of course, and there is obviously clearly a more, more of an intention to intervene. The ECN will not hesitate to take action against companies taking advantage of the current situation by cartelizing or abusing the dominant position. So they are still not very directly, even though abusing the dominant position could be an exploitative abuse by having the high prices. And the ECN goes as far as saying, oh, by the way, manufacturers should set could set maximum prices for their products, something that usually the ECN doesn't do. But it's clearly concerned with the response to be given to this. And then we move to the EU and Mrs. Vestager, who has already introduced excessive prices, particularly drug prices, action at the EU level. Goes much further and say, as the recent action by the British and Italian competition authorities, which I will talk about in a second show, there can be times when competition rules need to do their bits to deal with excessive prices. So we are quite a way away from the FTC or the US Justice Department position. Now, whether or not competition authorities have multifunction does make a difference. I have a quote here from Lord Theiler, who was at the time the chairman of the CMA, and says, we'll do whatever we can to act against rip-offs and misleading claims using any or all of our tools. So he certainly doesn't eliminate the possibility of using competition tool as well. And where we can't act, we'll advise government on further steps that they could take if necessary. So the threat of regulation, price control looms if necessary. The Italian authority has started several investigations, but one of them was early on. There was a request for information which was sent to the main online sales platform and other sales sites about the marketing of a hand sanitizer and disposable respiratory protection masks. And what was striking about this was that the competition authority was asking the internet sellers, the measures that they have implemented to avoid unjustified and disproportionate price increases. Okay, so to justify the fact. Okay, so in those two cases, we see clearly that competition authorities, which have a consumer protection as well as a competition protection, are not shy about starting investigations and using their powers, and sometimes mixing them in order to fight price gouging. Now, we do have some countries where, and Ukraine is one example, but it's not the only example, where the law is written in a way which makes it relatively easy, or at least less difficult, for the competition authorities to go against price increases by non-dominant firms. Because there's a provision which says that if several firms in an industry simultaneously or almost simultaneously increase their prices, and if those prices cannot be explained by objective factors, this could be an antitrust violation, a competition violation. And the Ukrainian Competition Authority has not been shy about starting investigation to pharmacies about price of face masks, to food retailers, but also in other sectors. For example, there was a big controversy in Ukraine about the price of airline tickets by Ukrainian international airlines because the price of tickets was multiplied by 2.5 at the beginning of the pandemic. The Anti-Monopoly Committee also went to mobile phone operators. So what's remarkable about this is not only the fact that, of course, the Ukrainian law makes it easier to try to investigate those cases and to find possibly an abuse, but also the fact that the Competition Authority of Ukraine is using a lot of soft power to deal with price gouging by sending recommendations or pronouncements. And this is also something that some other competition authorities have been doing. My last example, but I'm not going to spend much time on it, is because Tembi is here, is South Africa, where there was a change in the law which allowed the competition authority to have a lower burden of proof to go after price increases by establishing basically that the material price increase of a good or a service which does not correspond to the cost, to an increase in the cost, is or can be considered to be an abuse for the period of the pandemic. So we have a fairly pragmatic approach there, where the idea is to simplify the work of the competition authority, allow it to intervene, as well as the consumer protection authority, because they can both intervene during the time of the pandemic. So that's what I just wanted to share with you. Different responses depending on those variables that I've played with. But in most of the countries, except the US probably, a sense of the fact that competition authorities should be seen as doing something. And that's where we get to, my last comment is what Rosa said. Now, in the case of COVID, I think that there was an additional factor. Not only did we have both a supply and a demand breakdown, okay, but there was an additional factor, which was the fact that that there was hoarding, or that there was, this had a negative externality on society, because it meant that many people couldn't get the masks, or that the wrong people got the mask, but not the people who were working in hospitals, etc. So I think that there was an additional reason possibly to intervene, due to the fact that this was a case where the lack of adjustment between supply and demand created a negative externality over and beyond the fact that some people couldn't consume, but on the rest of society.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I think there's a lot to chew on there, especially in how that corresponds to what Dr. Metz and Commissioner Bonkalele might have to say. But in the meantime, let's keep moving on here. So next up on our speaking list is Professor Simon Roberts, who is the Economic Director at the UK's Competition Markets Authority, the CMA, that we've just heard so much about. He's been there since March 2019. He is also professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg, where he founded the Center for Competition, Regulation, and Economic Development, and has previously held the position of Chief Economist of the Competition Commission in South Africa from 2006 to 2012. So may also have some insights to share on the somewhat unique South African response to price gouging. For this presentation, Professor Roberts can provide some background on how the CMA has responded and what sort of price gouging issues we've seen here in the UK. So I'm going to attempt to unmute. This usually takes a second. And we're off.
Great, thank you very much. Well, my presentation fits very nicely after Romy's and Frédéric's presentation, because they've kind of given a run into the theory and even some background on what Lord Theiler said, who was the chair at the time, and so I'm going to talk about what we've actually been doing at the CMA. Before I do this, I will just say that the views are personal, not those of the CMA, but I'm talking about the issues the CMA faced from an economic perspective. Sorry, I'm just. So, I mean, this really runs through the same arguments that have been covered already. We've got to really think about what do we mean by the unreasonable or justified nature of the price increases, and really think about the interventions that we might be making and the potential harm versus the benefits. And what I'm going to explain is it really a kind of test case, I suppose, or an example of how the CMA approached that, very much bearing in mind where Professor Jenny finished up, which was that we're looking at the prices of products where these are things that people require, that if people aren't able to use them, there'll be externality effects, and the dangers that people will be hoarding them, and that those who are able to purchase will build up stockpiles, where those that need them, such as workers in public services, etc., with hand sanitizer, would not be able to get them, and so this was very much in our minds when we looked at how to address the issues. And the other thing I think was that I want to highlight was just how widespread the complaints were. We had the CMA set up a web form for people to complain, and there were 80,000 complaints altogether over the last 5 months or so. A large number of those, I should say, were about cancellations and mis-selling, claims being made about various cures and that kind of thing, but 16,000 were about pricing, where people had identified products from particular outlets and identified prices for those products relative to, in many cases, and the form asked this explicitly, relative to the prices that had been paid before the pandemic started to take effect. This shows you the mix of complaints over the period from March just up to the end of May, and it shows you that there was this combination of food. This is food and drink, but it was mainly related to food products, mainly staple food products. Things like rice and flour and bread, etc. Hygiene and personal care, which is a mixed basket of hand sanitizer and antiseptic, and medication, which was things like paracetamol. And the price increases were quite different, which was important in terms of the type of action that we took. So these are increases that were reported for particular specified products and particular specified outlets by the people who registered on the form. And you can see hand sanitizer stands out with 400% median increases, and the next closest was paracetamol, and the kind of food products as well as staples like toilet roll, which are really often complained of as a basket. So people were saying that I've been to shop in a local outlet and the toilet roll is this much higher, the fruit and veg prices are this much higher, flour is this much higher, meat prices are this much higher. Those are around about 100%, 150%, 150% higher. And this is again shows the kind of mixture of products that were complained of. Meat obviously is a very heterogeneous category. It's very difficult, and we spent some time trying to sort out some of the issues there. It includes chicken, but chicken was also separately identified, and we did spend some time going into that in more detail. And then hand sanitizer, masks, toilet paper, you can see as well. So the first thing that the CMA did is that is we looked at the outlets that were most complained of and analyzed the types of products. We got data to benchmark the prices in the main outlet groups of outlets. So we obtained data from two different sources on this for average prices in the main grocery outlets, as well as in averages for convenience stores and for pharmacies in the case of hand sanitizer in particular. And so we were able to see how the channels, the average prices in these channels, were changing over time for particular product specifications. So at a stock keeping unit level. We wrote to the most complained of outlets where the prices that were complained of had been big increases, and they seemed out of line with the benchmarks that we constructed for the averages in the channels. So on the basis that if there were wholesale price increases, then that would be reflected in retail price increases in the channel averages as a whole. And if there are prices increases which are above that, then those wouldn't be reflecting wholesale prices. But this was still just a letter writing and a kind of monitoring exercise. And over time, we noticed that the prices of things like toilet paper and food products seemed to fall back again. The complaints didn't continue, whereas the hand sanitizer price increases and complaints continued. So this shows you the averages for the that we constructed for the main grocery multiples, although slightly misleading, the main grocery multiples also includes the main national chemist chains. The two really big national chemist chains are actually included in the main, along with the main grocery multiples. And you can see the prices for this product, which is a 50 milliliter hand sanitizer product, changed relatively little. There were some increases in the end of March and some increases at the end of May, but very, very small in the grand scheme of things. But you can see the prices in independents and symbol group retailers, as well as in independent chemists, changed quite a lot. And we went back in the supply chain and looked at what was going on. So essentially kind of a fact-finding mission, if you like. The CMA took on itself the role to try and explain to the public what's happening here and to follow up with manufacturers and suppliers. And so these price increases reflect the fact that people were looking at two alternative sources, people were looking at importing, and there were suppliers entering the market who had to pay higher prices for some components. So we went we looked at the prices of ethanol and things like that, and plastic bottles and plastic caps, and if you had to air freight those plastic bottles and plastic caps in from other countries, how much that would cost. And these were behind the kind of price increases that we saw in these channels. It seemed to be alternative sources of supply coming in. However, there were individual outlets which were charging prices which were dramatically above this, by multiples above these benchmarks, and you can see that in there were some which were even higher than this. They're not included. They're off the scale of the chart, and these complaints continue to come in, and so we essentially decided we had to look at what other actions we could take rather than the kind of letter writing approach, and ultimately, having written to the outlets to ask them for evidence of the costs of cost increases behind this, and this would include invoices from their suppliers verifying the costs that they were being charged. Where we had concerns still, we opened a number of excessive pricing cases. We had a discussion around whether, in terms of the law, we should be looking at consumer protection or competition contraventions. Ultimately, we went with excessive pricing, so competition, and we looked at, to what extent were these outlets dominant. And a very important part of this was that when we looked at the local markets and the ability to charge these very high prices, we also did some mystery shopping to verify that the prices were still being charged. So, sales were being made at these prices. In other words, these greatly elevated prices. Consumers obviously are not therefore switching to the main grocery stores that there may be in the area or the chemist chains. And this was, I think, an important fact, because obviously consumer shopping behavior had changed quite dramatically, and particularly consumers who didn't have cars. So this went to a kind of vulnerable group of consumers, people who didn't have cars and were able to to drive around to find outlets in shopping malls potentially, and also where consumers would not want to shop around, would not want to go into 3 different outlets to try and find where there were still stocks available. And were making purchases at these very high elevated prices. So ultimately went with opening a very small number of excessive pricing cases. However, unlike the South African situation, we closed these cases after obtaining information and after engaging with the retailers, which, as they were independent retailers, the main national chains actually had been able to ramp up the sourcing of the products and had essentially maintained their prices relatively stable. So it was in smaller local markets where consumers had very poor alternatives, and we engaged there. But the cases were closed after this engagement and after including the changes that have been made by retailers in that level. So where does that leave us in terms of the CMA's approach and the CMA's thinking about this? The CMA sees this as justifying the pursuit of these matters, because there was also engagement with industry associations, industry bodies, wholesalers, etc. around this, and understanding how the supply chain worked and to make sure that supplies were flowing. So, for example, the General Pharmaceutical Council wrote to all pharmacies that have to be members, and although this doesn't relate to medicine that's being dispensed, there was an issue about people trusting their pharmacists to be fair to them, etc. So there was a kind of concerns were raised at that level. To engage with a whole set of stakeholders, there were issues raised about the kind of reputation effects and taking a longer-term view, and ultimately these cases were opened and then closed. So I think the CMA's view is that this is really represents the CMA being flexible and responsive to kind of assess and explain market outcomes. Because this was at the retail level, this wasn't about incentivizing increased supply. That would be prices going up at the wholesale level, and we looked at where, as I said, the amount by which prices would have to go up by. So it was felt it was important to take some action here to understand and evaluate what happened. The alternative that some countries have taken is to regulate prices, and some countries regulated prices for that 50 milliliter at around €2. I think that was the level taken in France, which was lower than the prices that were being charged, in fact, by some of the average prices being charged through some of the independent chains, which seemed to reflect some higher costs. So this was a more flexible approach than certainly price regulation. The CMA did suggest that that the kind of price gouging type powers might be helpful, and this would certainly have assisted in terms of the temporary dominance hurdle, which was very unusual from an excessive pricing case perspective. Although ultimately the ongoing sales at these higher prices we felt were justified opening the cases in terms of the market power being exerted, and in very exceptional circumstances that the pandemic had meant were in place. So that's where we are, where we ended up, and essentially much of the task team's work has now been wrapped up. But obviously, if there were other price increases, we would be looking at those again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. That's quite interesting, especially to those of us currently living in the UK. I think we're going to continue on with Dr. Daniel Gaynor. Our approach now is moving kind of from the general to the specific. Dr. Gaynor is going to be discussing regulatory responses and the regulatory framework in the United States as we move from the UK to the US. Just by way of introduction, Dr. Daniel Gaynor is a senior consultant in the competition practice at the Brattle Group. He specializes in applying economic and econometric tools to antitrust and competition matters with a focus on horizontal and vertical mergers. Prior to Brattle, he was an economist in the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission, so perhaps can provide some insight into the FTC's thinking and why they, or if indeed they view price gouging sort of in the dismissive manner that Jay maybe characterized it. His work at the FTC focused on mergers in the energy industries, and he's also contributed several reports on competition matters in the petroleum industry, including FTC 2006 report, an investigation of gasoline price manipulation, and post-Katrina gasoline prices. So for those of you who that name doesn't ring a bell, Katrina was the major hurricane that struck the Gulf Coast of the United States about a decade ago. And there was quite a bit of discussion about price gouging and price issues around then. So that's an interesting metaphor for our own era on perhaps a smaller scale. At any rate, Dr. Gaynor has also worked on several matters involving price gouging in gasoline and diesel markets, again, I think in sort of the Katrina environment. So Dr. Gaynor, over to you for a discussion of the regulatory environment in the US and the impact of price gouging there. And you're just gonna have to give a sec to unmute.
I apologize. Can you see my screen?
Looks fine from my end.
Perfect. Good morning, and thank you all for joining today. I'd like to start by thanking Max Theiler and Vidika Hedge for organizing this panel, for the other panelists who've joined, and everyone else who's on via Zoom. Given the manner and circumstances that brings us together today, the topic we're discussing, regulatory responses to COVID, to price gouging amid COVID-19, is a timely and important topic. Today, my discussion is going to focus on 3 key points. First, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to price gouging laws in the United States. Second, I'm going to provide a brief background on the applicability and enforcement of price gouging laws in the US, and focus on a significant event where these laws were widely applied. And that's, as we discussed earlier, alluded to, was the 2005 hurricane season, which primarily involved Hurricane Katrina, but also had a subsequent Hurricane Rita. And this is an interesting event, not only because of, as we'll discuss later, the price gouging laws in the United States are state laws, not only because they were widely applied, but as Professor Jenny said, there are no federal laws, and in particular, the Federal Trade Commission isn't charged typically with pursuing price gouging. But post-Katrina was a relatively unique circumstance where the FTC was given a definition of price gouging by Congress and told to investigate. So there was quite a bit of resources focused on looking at that, and I think there are certain lessons that can be learned. Which brings me to the final point I'm going to discuss today, which is identifying issues that complicate the effectiveness of US price gouging laws and how these issues can best be addressed. Before we begin, it's useful to bear in mind the important role that prices serve in competitive markets, especially during times of supply and demand disruptions. And I know Romy has went over this in greater detail, but I think that it's key to remember that the prices send a signal to consumers to conserve and producers to reorganize their production and increase supplies. And while Romy focuses on supply versus demand, I think, in certain circumstances, even with a supply disruption, for example, in the oil industry, you do see supply responses, typically coming from outside the typical region that supplies a given group of customers. And we'll address that in further detail. I think a central challenge with price gouging laws is determining which price is too high. Namely, what price goes beyond providing these useful market signals, and at what point a price becomes so high that it becomes repugnant. And I tend to favor the sort of Al Roth repugnant word, as opposed to most of the state laws that we'll discuss. They'll talk about an unconscionable or an unnecessarily high. I think the attempts to define these terms and the variance in the way they define them sometimes clouds the meaning. I think price gouging laws should focus on price outliers rather than market responses. Artificially low prices can cause, as Romy discussed, overconsumption, underproduction, and in certain cases, misallocation of resources. Too low of a price can also exacerbate a shortage by putting additional upward pressure on prices. For the present purposes in discussing COVID-19, I loosely classify products in 2 categories. I tend to think of essential healthcare provider COVID-19 type products. These would be things like N95 mask, personal protective equipment, COVID testing materials and respirators, versus consumer goods. These are goods that aren't essential for healthcare providers, but are the types of products that you or I would purchase at the grocery store, but nonetheless are affected by demand shocks from COVID-19. I think I make this distinction just so I can sort of set aside the essential healthcare products. It seems to me that those products are typically supply problems where the fundamental issue is a shortage. And although there are discussions of prices, for example, N95 masks, prices being charged to hospitals that are higher than they should be, I think the real issue, at least in the States, seems to have been the lack of supply. And that is propagated in itself in terms of, a lot of healthcare providers have been asking, the general public not to purchase the N95 masks because the nurses and doctors in the intensive care need those. So, and I think a better tool than a price gouging law for that might be something in the United States, if properly applied, something like the Defense Production Act, where you can actually address the shortage directly and effectively. So that being said, I think the remainder is my discussion, which is largely going to focus on the U.S. experience, is more geared towards what I'm calling the non-essential but necessary supplies. So as Dr. Jenny said, there are no federal price gouging laws. And the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ, while they occasionally look into it, do not have a formal charge to look into that. Instead, in the United States, there are state laws against price gouging. Currently, there are 36 states that have price gouging legislation. At the time of the hurricanes that we're going to discuss in a few minutes, which was Katrina and Rita in 2005, there were 29 states that had price gouging laws. And when you look at these laws, one of the things you notice is that there's a lot of variance in how the laws are written, but they have three fundamental parts to them. The first is they're only enforced during a state of an emergency, so they're focusing on non-persistent shocks, and they're typically supply shocks. The laws generally don't apply to all goods, but to necessary items, which are typically given specificity in the individual laws. And the laws have some sort of limit on a maximum price that can be charged. There's three general categories for what constitutes or how they define a maximum price. There's a limited number of states, in fact 4 states, I think it's still 4 states, that limit price increases to pass through of wholesale costs. There are 6 states that limit prices to a specified, I believe, predefined percentage price increase. And then the majority of states prohibit unconscionable or excessive prices during an emergency. But these generally do allow cost increases to justify their price, to offset these price increases. So this is one example of the price gouging statute for the state of Florida. And I've just highlighted those 3 components where there's the state of an emergency for essential commodities, which they define, and an unconscionable price. Now, in this, they attempt to go on further and define an unconscionable price as being grossly exceeding the average price for similar commodities or the prices that existed in the prior period. One of the things, 2 of the challenges with the definition of grossly exceeds, and also by tying what is too high of a price to the recent history. That could be particularly difficult in industries like the oil and gas industry, where there is, first of all, pretty dramatic seasonal changes in the supply and demand conditions. And in particular, those changes are, while somewhat predictable, often coincide with these supply disruptions. For example, in the petroleum industry, there's at the end of the summer, there's the peak Labor Day weekend, and shortly after that, there's the refinery turnarounds, where refineries in the process of switching from gasoline towards home heating oil and diesel. So comparing, by having laws that are gearing your price gouging to, the supply and demand conditions a month earlier could be complicating. So, what is the U.S. experience with price gouging laws? I think there was probably the primary event is, as we discussed, the Hurricane Katrina in 2005. To give you a little background, Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 hurricane that entered the Gulf of Mexico and made landfall in Louisiana in late August of 2005. This was the primary supply disruption. However, about a month later, in mid to late September, I think it was September 18th, a second, slightly smaller hurricane, Hurricane Rita, also entered the Gulf and made landfall in Louisiana as well, within a couple of 100 miles of Katrina. During this period, there was obviously a lot of interest in price gouging, but it was primarily focused on price gouging for resale and wholesale gasoline. And this is largely because the petroleum infrastructure in the United States or for large portions of the United States, starts in the Gulf. The largest refinery complex is in the Houston, Louisiana area. So that supplies what's called PADD 3, which is the southern United States, as well as a majority of the east coast of the United States, really all the way up to Philadelphia is the next closest refinery. And there's two pipelines, the Plantation and the Colonial, that run from Louisiana up the East Coast. And so most of the states in the Southeast, as well as Florida, which gets supplies from the Gulf via barge, are highly dependent on those refineries. So following these hurricanes, a lot of the states were actively involved in looking at price gouging. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the Federal Trade Commission was asked to look into price gouging. And we had a sort of a complementary set of tools. We looked at gasoline prices for thousands of retail stations, as well as rack prices, to try and identify possible candidates. And I think one of the things we learn from the experience in these examples of states, state number sort of speaks to that, is given the way the rules are written, it's difficult to actually identify price gouging. I think at the end of the day, what they generally found as price gouging were outlier prices. A lot of the prices that they thought were high were really market adjustments. And I think, for example, in Florida, of the 9,000 they have 9,000 stations in Florida. During the post-Katrina period, Florida alone had 5,200 complaints. I believe the Department of Energy also had a hotline that had additional complaints. And at the end of the day, the state filed 2 price gouging complaints. At the other end of the spectrum is Georgia, who was the most active in terms of pursuing price gouging and reaching settlements, and they reached 66. So, as I said, it can be difficult to determine the extent to which price increases are greater than necessary. I mean, how do you distinguish a market signal from gouging? Over-enforcement in price gouging risks exacerbating a problem by muting the supply and demand reactions. But that being said, how would you pursue U.S. price gouging, or what U.S. price gouging considerations I think should be made? I think an effective price gouging law should recognize that price increases some degree of price increases during supply or demand shocks or emergencies are necessary. And therefore, you should set the bar relatively high so that you're discouraging the opportunistic behavior while not muting the necessary supply and demand responses. And I think also, and this is something that is in most current laws, there needs to be allowances for cost pass-throughs, as these laws typically are focused on downstream retail sectors. That concludes my introduction.
Okay, thank you very much. That's quite interesting. I have some follow-ups on that, but I guess we'll wait for the questions section. So our next and final speaker is Commissioner Tembinkosi Bonkalele, Commissioner of the South African Competition Commission since 2013, and is also an adjunct visiting professor of law at Wits Law School, an associate of the European Summer School and Conference in Competition and Regulation of Athens University of Economics and Business, fellow of the University of Johannesburg Center for Competition, Regulation, Economic Development, and a board member of the University of Stellenbosch's Center for Competition Law and Economics. Commissioner Bonkalele provided an overview of the South African competition's response to the pandemic-related price gouging complaints and the impact of that response, which I think, as we'll see, has been somewhat more robust than some of the other jurisdictions we've talked about. So, Tembi, take it away. You should be unmuted.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. I've just shared a wrong slide. I need to unshare this. Share. Thanks very much. I will try and avoid repeating some of the things that have been said. So I will not talk through all my slides, and I will rather focus on the cases that we've had in South Africa, and perhaps clarify a few things also about our approach. So the first starting point perhaps is just to indicate that the Commission has an obligation to promote and maintain competition in the Republic in order to provide consumers with competitive prices and product choices, which is a sort of what is most competition authorities are there to do, but also to advance the social and economic welfare of South Africans. And I suppose this also will somehow talk to the issue that Professor Jenny has referred to, that in South Africa we have to balance these, if you like, efficiency issues with their social impact. Just in the both preamble of the legislation as well as the outline of its substantive purposes in its substantive provisions. And price increases applied in an emergency such as COVID-19 have a very detrimental impact on the poor, as well as small businesses, who are in any event already the most vulnerable, even without such an emergency. And it is for this reason that the Commission has prioritized the investigations, prosecutions, as well as encouraged a speedy adjudication of these cases to protect consumers. The Commission's first response to this was to first reach out through advocacy. So we had a massive advocacy campaign, which was targeted at the firms that were supplying these critical products. In fact, the change in the law, Fred referred to, was in a way also a part of advocacy, in the sense that it was not really new law, but it was emphasizing an aspect of the law by way of a regulation, and in a way putting it out there for the suppliers to know. But it also had another consequence, which is that the consumers now, being aware of this law, also started bringing a lot of complaints to the Commission. In fact, the number of complaints we received just in this period were equivalent to the number of investigations that we usually receive in 5 years. So quite a huge public response. Of course, not all of these were relevant, and they covered similar products as have been discussed here by other panelists. And we have so far concluded more than 30 settlement agreements where the firms have accepted that this was a contravention of the Competition Act. But we have 2 cases that were contested, and these were quite interesting. The one case is still live in a way because we've just argued it last week at the Competition Appeal Court. The other case, which involved a retail chain, a pharmaceutical retail chain, there was an appeal there, but they withdrew the appeal at the door of the court. So we still have one outstanding judgment, and it's about the test that I'm going to discuss very briefly here. And our referral of these cases are based on when I say referral, I mean prosecutions, are based on our excessive pricing provisions. So we don't have a specific legislation addressing price gouging. And the Section 8 has been a subject of a lot of debate in South Africa, a controversial debate, I should say, and some controversial court decisions. In the past, the exploitative pricing or excessive pricing would be measured in terms of the economic value compared to the price that was charged. And that was changed after much controversy. So economic value was replaced by a competitive price. So this is now the law that's applicable. And we have some thresholds, so not every firm can be considered dominant in South Africa, and price gouging or excessive pricing only applies to dominant firms. And there are safe harbors. For example, there is a market share indication that you should have. Should you have at least 35% or above, you are deemed to be dominant. And there's also a financial threshold, so firms that are too small cannot be dominant. And market power is also an alternative to dominance. So you could just go to market power sometimes. And market power is defined as the ability of a firm to control prices or exclude competition, or to behave to an appreciable extent independent of competitors, consumers, or suppliers. So that is the law. So the first test in excessive pricing is really whether the price is higher than the competitive price. And if so, the second is whether any such difference is unreasonable. And if the first leg of the test is satisfied, in other words, the Commission has shown that the price is higher than a competitive price, the onus falls on the respondent firm to show that the super-competitive price is reasonable, having regard to all the relevant factors. And our law specifically lists those relevant factors. And they are the usual that are found in most case law around the world. So it's a collation really of what everybody else has been doing. And we were aided in enforcement, as Fred says, by a regulation. So there's a possibility in South Africa that a minister of state can outline regulations that facilitate the implementation of any law. And sometimes those regulations could actually extend the ambit of the law itself within certain constraints that are well known here. So the minister issued consumer protection regulation, which records that a relevant and critical factor for determining whether a price is excessive or unfair, one would need to look at the materiality of that price increase, whether it corresponds to equivalent increase in cost. So costs before the increase were very relevant, and whether the increase in the margin of markup is also above the average margin of markup in the 3 months prior to the crisis. So that made it slightly easier, because the test now, instead of that broad excessive pricing test that is applicable in general, in the case of these particular COVID-19 cases, the minister directed the test towards the price that applied before and the margin that was earned after the setting of the crisis. And what is curious, though, is that both cases that were contested at the tribunal happened before these regulations. So in other words, the government was a little late in its reaction, in the sense that when we investigated and prosecuted, we found that these regulations only became effective on the 19th of March, but the price increases had occurred before then, a lot of them towards the end of February and especially the beginning of March. So that didn't aid us a lot in the prosecution of the cases. But what I think aided us were the facts, because the facts were quite compelling. For an example, in one of the cases, actually a smaller supplier, which is Bonkalele, the price increase were at some stage recorded at 888% for masks, and the average markup was over 500%. And in the case of Discam, again, it was a question of masks, and price increases were up to 317%. So although, as I say, this happened after the regulations took place, I think the facts themselves, in fact, this became a big subject of discussion last week during the appeal hearing, where I can tell you, I think we were very strong on facts, even though some of the judges expressed some ambivalence on adopting the test that we were proposing. But given these facts, I think they all accepted that there was a reason to be concerned for the debate that we were having, because none of these players experienced any cost increases prior to the period. Some said they were anticipating that there may be increases in the future. Some were anticipating some supply disruptions. But during that period, there is no evidence whatsoever that there was any increase in their costs. So one could say that this was clearly opportunistic. It was clear that the increases were as a result of the crisis and perhaps some panic buying from consumers. On appeal, I should also mention very quickly that the major issue was that the respondent really argued that for us to prosecute an excessive pricing case, there was a jurisdictional question, and that we needed to define the market. So in other words, once the market, our case could fall or stand on that market definition, something that we didn't do precisely, and we argued that the exercise of market power is in itself, which i.e. the increase in pricing, is a demonstration of how these firms were dominant and were exploiting that dominance. And the tribunal, the competition tribunal, which is our court of first instance, agreed with this formulation and found that market delineation is merely a means to an end. So if you can establish through other means that market power was exercised, you didn't need to go through this. And the tribunal in the other case system went further to explain that whilst market shares and defining the relevant markets are usually the analytical tools deployed in the inquiry to assess the extent of the firm's market power, these are not the only tools available to a competition regulator. So that was really the essence. And I believe that this is also the position expressed by the OECD, that in some cases it may not be preferable to look for direct evidence of exploitation of market power, for example, abnormally high prices or profits, rather than to focus on market definition. So in other words, market definition could, in certain circumstances, be skipped, where you can clearly see abnormally high prices and abnormally high profits. So I don't want to go through all of that debate. I think everybody kind of understands that. And I should say that it was very helpful as well that there was this body of literature that seemed to support this. Dave Lewis, who is an iconic figure here in competition law, used to head the tribunal, wrote in 2005, in other words, long before this crisis, that the competition authority may conceivably be called upon to act as a price regulator in instances that may be characterized as price gouging. And he cites that this could be necessary in situations of a national disaster, which can give rise to a temporary monopoly situation. And we also cited in the court an opinion by Professor Mortar, which also goes along similar lines, that firms that may be accused of price gouging might not necessarily be dominant in ordinary times. So in other words, there is a specific time that as a result of a disaster that one can find market power of firms. So I think that I will skip most of these and just maybe indicate that in the court there was some debate about the correct test for determining an excessive price, in particular on why the cost of return on capital was not a relevant benchmark. Here I can simply say that this test is obviously very complicated, and if indeed that is to be the test going forward, this would make it very difficult to prosecute these sorts of cases. The other issue that was debated quite a lot was the extent of evidence required. In other words, did you talk to customers? Did they have the opportunity or possibility of shopping around the split test kind of thing? I think that those things are very good and normal under normal circumstances. But when you have an emergency, even investigations have to be done in a speedy manner. And a test adopted here will determine whether or not we are able to do this sort of enforcement in the future. So in South Africa, the jury is still out. I think we have settled a lot of cases, over 30 of them, but I think the precedent is yet to be set. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner. I think, unfortunately, we're down to the sort of the last few minutes here on our official time span. I don't think we're going to get kicked off, so we can go over a little bit if people want to stick around. But I think with our last few minutes, I did want to give all the panelists the opportunity to, pose a question to the other panelists or address a point that they would like to from another panelist presentation. So I think given the short amount of time we have for this, I'm going to try and use the hand raising system on the panelist window, if you're all familiar with that. So if you'd like to sort of raise a point about another panelist presentation, if you can go ahead and use the hand raising thing there, and then I can just unmute. Yeah, okay. Professor Jenny, you should be unmuted. There you are.
Just two points. It seems to me that the competition authorities which were really in a bind were competition authorities that pretend to have a strict consumer surplus approach to competition law on the one hand, but on the other hand, didn't want to intervene in case of price gouging in countries where there are no other laws, and didn't want to use the competition. And I think I want to make 2 points. The first one is that we haven't mentioned the dimension of time in our discussion. But, and I think that we should, because a shortage can have different meaning depending on which is the time perspective that you adopt. On the one hand, it's a virtuous mechanism because it will increase supply next year, next month, whenever in the future. On the other hand, it may be in the short run a massive disruption, a negative externality. So I think that when we talk about those things, I mean, we should have this time dimension and be clearer about what is the right time perspective, particularly in the case of a pandemic that one has in mind, because maybe some intervention could be justified in the very short term to try to limit the externality. The second thought I have was that competition authorities, which have a very strict consumer surplus approach, should not go around telling people that they protect consumer surplus, because that's not what they do. What they do is they promote economic efficiency, which in most cases, but not in all cases, is good for consumer surplus. But when they go around saying we're here to protect consumer surplus, they create expectations on the part of people who are not economists and do not understand why it is that they are not going to act when it's clear that their consumer surplus seems to be in danger, by saying, well, that's part of the mechanism which ultimately will lead to a more efficient or a better allocation of resources. So I think that there's a little bit of, I mean, things would be clearer if competition authorities recognize that they are interested in economic efficiency. And they may say that occasionally, or in most of the time, this economic efficiency will lead to the protection of consumer surplus, rather than pretending to be on the side of consumers right from the beginning. And I think there is a lot in many countries. That's why the competition authorities felt the urge to intervene, because they were under pressure, because people did not really understand why they wouldn't do anything about the situation. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, Romy, I can just, should go in a sec there.
There, thank you. I think there is a good point by Professor Jenny. I have a little bit of a different perspective in some ways, but I think it fits nicely with the comment he made. When you think, for example, about market manipulation laws in the securities and commodities context, the goal is not typically to be protecting consumer surplus, is to be protecting prices so that they are reflective of market conditions, true market fundamentals rather than market abuse. I think that price gouging is a little bit more in that context, at least the way I see it as an economist. It is more about, are we really looking at prices that are reflective of, in this case, extreme market conditions, or do we see price abuse, price artificiality, independently of whether or not that is protecting consumer surplus? Of course, we're talking about antitrust, so we should be focusing on that. But from my perspective, I do tend to see that the price gouging aspect of things more as a manipulation kind of rule, and the FTC has anti-manipulation rules and in some energy markets, rather than the pure traditional antitrust approach.
Okay. Other responses from other panelists there? Would you like to address? Yeah, okay. I think I'm just going to unmute everybody here.
Okay. Thanks very much. I just wanted to add to that from the CMA point of view. I think from the approach which was taken, there's a vulnerable consumers aspect to it, which is that there are small groups of consumers, in this case in local markets, who are vulnerable to this market power. And the question is, how much do you care about them? And it may be for very short periods of time. So that's one thing, I think. And I think this talks to a wider set of issues, which is to what extent the competition authorities actually want to say that these kind of things matter and trust in markets is important, and we have to pay attention to this. It chimes with some of the other work that the CMA is doing around loyalty penalties, where people who are buying insurance, whatever, are getting are not very, very, very savvy and not really checking. You could argue they're too rich to worry about it, but actually the findings are that they often are low-income people, older people, and they're vulnerable to the fact that their premiums go up, by very, very large amounts after the first year on automatic renewals, right? So I think there's a really, it feeds into a wider set of questions for, are competition authorities going to take on a kind of refereeing role of markets more widely? And if they are going to do that, the other thing I think is that competition authorities need to be able to get data quickly. And this is a really big problem, because it's one of the reasons that the CMA, essentially started the investigations, was because we need the powers to obtain data. And we're in a world now where if you're looking at market information, there's a huge amount of data in the hands of private providers who will sell this to you for the very large amounts of money. And competition authorities can only require data from people if they start formal investigations. And I think there's a kind of a process point here as to how we obtain data more quickly, which is data that exists, so kind of zero marginal cost to provide it to a competition authority, and what are the right ways to go about doing that?
I wonder if I could come in here, just maybe to explain our approach, that we were not looking for an analytically perfect situation. I think we understood that these were very unusual times. And indeed, some of the debates before the Competition Tribunal and before the Competition Appeal Court might have shown that maybe a better way could be to strengthen consumer protection laws. I think there's going to be a lively debate in South Africa about whether we need to combine competition law and consumer protection law in order to play this role of protecting consumers. So if you like, it was a period where we had to try enforcement and test its limits. And you can't, I think, reach a point where you say, let us improve the law without doing that. So I readily accept that there may well be some analytical shortcomings on using excessive pricing, especially for this. For one thing, it is incredibly difficult, and for the other, there's a lot of skepticism, including from the bench. Thank you.
Sort of on a related note, I did have a question. I was wondering if to what extent, and I'd be interested to hear from those panelists who have experience with and were directly sort of in contact with the regulators in their countries. To what extent were regulators pushed into the position almost of being a public health official, where, you know, if the product that you're looking at is masks and hand sanitizers, and, you know, the extent to which these are being widely distributed rather than being allocated, you know, on the basis of ability to pay, is not only sort of a question of consumer surplus, but also a question of how much impact the pandemic itself is going to have, right? If more hand sanitizer is being used, more masks are being used, the overall impact is going to be not as bad as it would have been otherwise. Did considerations, you know, these sort of epidemiological considerations, did that come into the thinking at all on how aggressive the enforcement is going to be? Or is that sort of far outside the way that these regulators usually respond to like an emergency?
I mean, from our side, I can say that certainly did play a role. It's a matter of strategy. We believe in the Commission that we have some discretion to determine our strategy, and strategy can be informed by current events. So certainly, when more and more people buy a particular product, and that particular product is crucial for their well-being, our strategy could change and that product could be a priority. And this is certainly what happened around COVID-19. So masks, sanitizers, and even things like toilet paper all of a sudden became part of our strategy. They were not before COVID-19. So this did certainly have an impact. And I should also accept that even the concerns by government might have played a role, because with them strengthening the law, that was a very clear indicator of, in a sense, of what was the current national priority at that time.
I think, I mean, I don't, you know, I'm speaking from just a personal capacity here, of course. I think, I mean, obviously we were mindful of the importance of hand sanitizer for, you know, people who are like going to work every day, who are playing a public role, public service, providing public services and those kind of things. I mean, so this was an important consideration. But it was really that the price increases were persisting, and that there was evidence of ongoing sales, so the consumers in these particular local markets didn't have alternatives. I think this was really critical to us. So this, therefore, the kind of substantial market power being exerted, existing and being exerted. Whereas in the food products, the price complaints didn't carry on. So they fell away. Letters were written. We looked at supply chains a little bit, but it was really about the persistence and the essential nature of the product. I think there were the two important features.
Okay, I guess one last question I want to, we're now a bit over time, so I thank you all for hanging in there with me, but I guess just one last point I wanted to raise maybe, and then I'll let you go, is this question of kind of some of the vagueness that you see in some of the laws around, you know, what the definition of a bad, you know, versus a good price cap or price rise is. A good price rise in the sense that Romy has you know, mentioned and elucidated on, which is that, you know, it preserves supply for the, you know, for those who need it and for over a time span where it's needed. Bad in the sense that it's exploitative. But when you call something unconscionable or unreasonable, and you kind of, the definition of it is a little bit funny. What, you know, to what extent do economists, you know, in the private, this is an issue close to my own heart as an economist in the private sector. To what extent do economists in the private sector or kind of third-party resources have an opportunity to weigh in on that question of whether something is unconscionable or unreasonable? You know, how much economics goes into that question?
I mean, I think that's, and Romy can probably speak to that as well with her work on screens, but I think that is the real challenge. And it probably varies depending on the products you're looking at, because what you're trying to do, again, is there's the balancing act you're trying to do is preserving your supply and demand responses that will ultimately help you overcome the inherent shortage, but at the same time, you're trying to avoid the opportunistic behavior that also probably exists at the other extreme. And, you know, for certain products, that those supply and demand responses might be more important than others. Gasoline, which is my experience, they're pretty important in both instances. I mean, if after the hurricane, you, to the extent possible, you want to try and have prices that'll promote conservation. And at the same time, you know, even though the hurricanes that we looked at, Katrina and Rita, it wiped out a really large portion of the refinery infrastructure and shut down major pipelines, there was still supply responses from outside that region, whether they were, you know, other pads that weren't relying on the Gulf Coast as much as they ordinarily would, or imports of blend stocks or crude oil from other countries. So in fact, after Katrina, you would see the Netherlands crude prices had a price reaction. And now, you know, that's I think 30 or 40 days to get there, but you know, that was anticipation that was going to be a pretty persistent shock.
Okay. So I think we're now, unfortunately, pretty much 10 minutes over. I'm going to have to call it off here. Unless anybody has sort of any final remarks they'd like to sort of, I'll give you the opportunity to get in the last word. I think we're going to wrap up here. So any sort of final remarks anybody would like to make? Okay. Well, thank you so much for dialing in, all of our attendees and all of our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this with us and put together your presentations. It's been very interesting. I hope to speak to you again in the near future.